Welcome. We're here today to continue our discussion around site-based expenditure reporting. I certainly hope that you took a look at our videos in October, which were about why is it here and what are we doing. And then in February, we responded to the guidance that was published in January and gave you some good opportunities to look into that guidance document. Today, our focus is going to be on implementation. What should you be doing now to prepare for reporting at the end of fiscal 19? And to help me do that, I have a panel of very excellent folks here that are going to help us with that. I'm Mike Jacoby. I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. And next to me is Susan Harkin. She's the Chief Operating Officer of District 300. Mike Dubeck is the Director of Operations, and he's also the CSBO for LaGrange Highlands School District 106. From ISBE, we have Sarah Shaw. She's the Senior Manager for Fiscal and Academic Solvency. And then Carrie Stewart is here with us. She's the Managing Director of Afton Partners. And before we dive into the discussion of implementation, we want to first sort of rewind a little bit and go back to the why. Why are we here? What's driving all of this? And where are we in the process? So Sarah, I'm going to throw that to you. Just recap a little bit about what is site-based expenditure reporting and why are we doing this in Illinois?
And we do go back to the law in every case because it is right there and it grounds all of the decisions that we make about what we are mandated to do, what choices we make in implementation. So the ESSA legislation that was enacted in 2015 states that states must start reporting on their report cards, which are publicly available, per pupil expenditures of actual personnel and actual non-personnel expenditures of federal, state, and local funds disaggregated by source of funds. So you have your federal pot of money and then your state and local pot of money for each LEA and for each school for the preceding fiscal year. In other words, we are now not only reporting our district level expenditures, but also our site level or school-based expenditures. And that includes the district centralized costs that get allocated down to the site level. This reporting, while federally mandated, is in line with statewide goals and initiatives. So it's been very well integrated, and we've really appreciated all the work to make sure that it is in line with what we're already doing and matching up with where the state is moving.
Good. So Susan, you were part of the advisory committee, and that committee set up some goals for what this should be, and ISBE and Afton is a part of that as well. So what are the goals that the committee came forward with?
So the first phase of the advisory group was to develop value statements. How would we drive the work that was being done by the advisory group? And we were looking at it beyond just compliance. How can we use that information to drive local decisions on what is in the best interest for our students? So we grounded in about 4 different principles, which would allow us to say, how do we make resource allocations so that it's accessible to our stakeholders and our schools? How do we empower our LEAs to assess their internal equity for their students and improve it? We want to enable LEAs and communities to gain a better understanding of the relationship between student outcomes and fiscal resources. And the last piece was, how do we identify evidence-based practices and opportunities and foster that innovation between our school districts? ISBE convened an advisory group that consisted of superintendents, school business officials, and the association leaders to ensure that the challenges that were in front of us were vetted through those people because they would ultimately have to implement what these requirements would entail. In year 1, we founded everything on guiding principles that was founded in complying with the ESSA reporting requirements, but also acknowledging the fact that school districts know their data best. These guiding principles led to the guidance document that now we're referring to and has as a resource to all of us that are in the process of implementing that. That was developed in January. It is on the ISBE website. It's prominently displayed. It's in the superintendent's report, so you can find it easily. We developed a training plan to help guide us and as a resource for all of us as we move forward. And in fact, today's video is an outcome and a recommendation that the group came up with.
So Susan, and as a reminder to everyone, you mentioned that website. And I'm going to say it, and we're going to put it on the screen, and we're going to say it again a little bit later, but it's www.isbe.net/ESSA. And at that same link, you can find those 2 previous recorded videos. You can also find the reporting guidance that was published in January. Let's shift our discussion now to today's focus, which is about what you can be doing now to prepare for this reporting. So, Sarah, I'm going to throw that to you. I know the advisory group provided some recommendations for districts to consider doing right now. So give us a sense of what those implementation recommendations are.
Sure. And we had some initial conversations during the rollout of the reporting guidance that we've since been able to go much more in depth with, thanks in no small part to the work of the advisory group and other working groups that we've convened. We do have a suggested district implementation timeline, which is on that same website, www.isbe.net/ESSA, that we referred to earlier. And if anyone has not already checked out that timeline, I really highly encourage it. It lays out suggested steps between now and when this first reporting happens. And generally for immediate preparations, our recommendations fall into 2 major buckets. First is around communication, and the other is around data reporting preparations. These are things that you need to be doing to be setting the stage for the conversations that are going to happen, but also around just getting your data in and making sure that things are spick and span. So regarding communications, our recommendation has been to ensure that key district leaders are aware of and understand these reporting requirements. Certainly there will be deeper conversations in the future, but first let's just start with awareness. Do the key district people in your district know that this is coming? And districts may also want to start having conversations about the value of these requirements. Susan talked to us about the value proposition that the advisory group came to. That's a really worthwhile conversation to be having within your own district of what could these data points mean for us. And it gives the beginnings of a shared understanding across the district. Beyond communications and awareness, there are some critical steps that business offices can be doing right now to make this reporting easier on the back end. So some front end preparations now will go a long way later next year for an easier and more accurate development of those data. I should note that some of these recommendations, actually all of these recommendations, also apply to districts that do not have business offices. We acknowledge that there are some capacity concerns or other limitations that may make these recommendations look a little bit different from district to district. These are all recommendations for adaptation to local context.
Carrie, I know your team worked many hours with some of the people on the advisory committee, business officials, and actually doing some test cases in regard to this reporting process. And based on that, you have some recommendations regarding the data reporting preparation. So share a few of those with us.
Sure. So just for context, we worked with 3 districts ranging in size from 3 schools to 30 schools. And we worked with this what we call test data, really for a number of reasons. First, just as part of developing the guidance document, we wanted to make sure that some of the policy decisions that were in the guidance document were informed by what we saw in districts' test data. And we could test out some of those policy decisions along the way before they became final. Second, we wanted to see a spectrum of types of coding and accounting that's currently being done as a way to inform how we might shape some of the recommendations that we have. So we do have some recommendations, but I want to call them exactly that, recommendations, meaning that in no way does the guidance document suggest that any accounting practices need to change. That is not a mandate. However, in going through this process, we realized that there are definitely some things that districts can do on the front end of the year to make this reporting easier on the back end. I do want to point out that when we worked with these test districts, we were using data that in no way was prepared for site-based expenditure reporting. And so we do know that this reporting can be done without any preparation. However, there are definitely a few things that can be done on the front end, again, to make folks' lives easier on the back end. And I'll go through a couple of those recommendations. The first and foremost is just creating location codes. So there's already part of the IPAM where you can code school sites as well as central costs to certain location codes. If your district is not currently utilizing those, we encourage you to consider utilizing those. And then second, and along with that, is just personnel. Of course, most districts have over half of their costs are personnel costs. And you could, on the front end of the year, take the time to code positions and positions to these location codes. And as a result of that, every time you're running payroll, you can be booking your salary expenses 2 locations on the back end of the year, over half of your expenses are already going to be recorded to school sites, making your life a lot easier. Third thing that we saw is just source of funds. So as you all mentioned, this law does require disaggregating source of funds between federal and state and local. To the extent that districts are able to identify those expenditures that are funded by federal funds on the front end of the year, again, just having a plan for that going into the year is going to allow you to make reporting federal expenditures so much easier. And then fourth, in the guidance document itself, there are a number of expenditures that are excluded from this reporting, examples being debt, capital, adult and community services. To the extent that those are not easily identifiable expenditures, currently you'll want to make sure that you can identify them on the front end of the year so that you are not searching for them at the end of the year while you're putting this reporting together. So again, those are just a few things that we think if you're going to make some changes, those would be the ones to consider doing that would have the most bang for the buck, if you will.
Thanks, Carrie. Susan, you were part of that. You were one of the test districts. So tell us a little bit about what you learned and what you're doing right now to prepare for this reporting.
So you're absolutely correct. We did use District 300's FY17 actual data with Carrie's Afton team. And I thought I was going to be in great shape as we headed into it because we were using location codes extensively, but I found out we did have gaps currently in our accounting system. As an example, I found out that we have EL teachers that are utilized at our specific schools, but it was being charged to a centralized district expenditure. So that certainly was concerning. Another gap for us is we have a district charter school. So we had to work through some of the challenge that was unique to our school district that we wanted to make sure on the front end we got correct, because I really believe if you can do that work on the front end, it is going to be a lot simpler. So what we're doing to address those pieces is we are going to look at all of our salaries that are charged to a central location and make a determination if they truly should be charged to a school site. I will be working closely with the business office and our human resources department as new positions and new hires are made, making sure to the extent that they belong at a school site that accounting code is set up right from the very beginning. And we will be doing all of this by July 1st, because as we enter the year, undoing that and as we get busier, it will become very difficult. In relationship to our charter school, a couple things will happen there. We will be setting up meetings with them, one, just to let them know this is coming. The second piece is making sure that the financial data that we can get for them complies with the new regulations. And then I have to make sure that they understand what these requirements are, because they will also have information reported for them, and they need to understand the implications in relationship to how that will be reflected on our school report card. So those were some of the opportunities for us that we were uncovered through this process.
That's great. And so many districts won't have a charter school, but for those that do, it's really important for them to understand they have to be in this reporting mindset as well. Mike, what are you and your team doing?
Sure. Well, in LaGrange Highlands 106, we're actually in very good shape, to your earlier point, Carrie, about the staff and position budgeting them to a specific site. But we do have some areas where we can analyze district expenses for some of our centralized departments, be that teaching and learning, operations and maintenance, et cetera. And so one thing we're focusing on early and often in 106 is communication and making sure that all of our key business office staff, payroll, bookkeeping, et cetera, know about this and know what changes we can make or should make. And we may choose to split some accounts and not others, but having that communication up front with our team. And given that it's budget season right now, meeting with each of our administrators to kind of tease apart where we want to do that. Just to kind of jump on some of your examples, we are also evaluating, be that curricular resources, electricity, some of our special services. You mentioned EL. We also have some special education costs that are centralized right now, and just determining whether or not we want to leave them that way and assess it at the end of the year, or if we can build in some location codes and do some of that work on the front end.
So let's go to one of the challenging things that Carrie mentioned related to federal funding. and federal funded items. So how are you guys working through the process of disaggregating those federal expenditures by school and then also versus the local and state expenditures?
So I think there's two opportunities for us in that area. To disaggregate federally funded expenditures in state and local, we do need to create some new accounts as we enter the budget season. You're absolutely right. You want to think about that piece now. But I think the more important piece that I've reflected on since then is we really need to educate people that are involved in that process. For me, it's anybody that touches the grant, to the extent that the teaching and learning team is involved with that. I need to give them the why. If I provide them the why as to why we're trying to do something, that generally helps them be more motivated to make the changes that will need to occur. And giving them that background knowledge will help us get to a place that will make it more simple by the end of the year. So I really believe the early conversations and engaging them on why we're doing it and the need to do it and the benefits of doing it, I think are really critical in this overall next step.
Yeah, and our district is handling this by reviewing program codes similarly for the grants up front, but I think it's really crucial for district leaders to collaborate on this, to your point. I know some districts have that kind of built in inherently already, and some may not when it comes to grant budgeting. For example, if a portion of a staff member's salary has been allocated to a Title I grant or an IDEA grant, the school business official should meet with the curriculum director or special education director. And to your earlier point, Carrie, about staff and Sarah, about the resources a district may have, there might be limitations in place in terms of who needs to be at that table, or it may look different for each district, but I think that collaboration is really key. That way everyone's on the same page for what's budgeted in the grant, and that might mean that creating new accounts or splitting salaries for that grant can be done on the front end. For LaGrange Highlands, we've historically tracked those federal grant expenses, but not by site. So we'll be adding location codes into those.
So, Carrie, what more can we say about this sort of this central cost allocation? It seems to me like this is a challenge too. I mean, just large expenditures across the district that are associated with all schools. So what are some things you could say about that?
Sure. So first, we've been getting a lot of questions about how to allocate centralized expenditures. And as you'll see in the guidance document, we're leaving a lot of the decisions to district discretion, and that's intentional. One of the first things that we suggest doing, first and foremost, is just drawing a circle around what is truly your site-based expenditures, and then what is actually your centralized expenditure. So Susan made the great point about right now she's got some ELL teachers that are coded centrally, but they're actually going to be site-specific. So that's just the first step, is understanding what is centralized expenditures. And then second, we would suggest looking at your centralized expenditures by function and thinking through some of the most material centralized expenditures. For example, transportation, special education services, facility services come to mind as three of the bigger ones. And really thinking about what drives the level of service and what drives where those services are provided. Sometimes those services are driven by square footage of a building, sometimes driven by the number of kids that have IEPs in the building, et cetera. And so those are the ways to think about how those costs and services work in the first place. And so districts can consider that when they're determining how to allocate those costs to school sites.
As a specific example, Carrie, I think just how we're going to record for the centrally managed special education costs, such as a speech pathologist, a psychologist, some of those might actually be allocated to multiple buildings and recorded as a central allocation expenditure. So people want to start thinking about how are they capturing the data right now so that they can actually have some allocation method. And certainly the guidance document gives some considerations. One example might be as the IEP students that they serve. Another item might be how many are the related service minutes that they're actually provided. And lastly, you might even track specific time for that employee or contractual person to each building and allocate it from that perspective. Again, the appendix in the guidance document really provides some really good insight as to how you might want to start thinking about that now. This isn't meant to be overly burdensome, though. It really is supposed to be a reflective practice on how are we utilizing those services. But at the end of the day, it should be an honest accounting and reflection of how they're supporting your schools, so that the costs get captured at the right level for purposes of this reporting.
I agree, and I think it's similar for other areas as well. I'll go back to operations and maintenance, as I mentioned earlier. For example, electricity costs or heating and cooling costs may or may not be billed from separate invoices right now by site in a school district. I know that's something that we're dealing with right now. The same might be true for custodial services spread across multiple sites where the cleaning times might vary and allocating those staff might be more difficult. So for those reasons, it might make sense to centrally manage some of those O&M costs. In my district, in order to allocate those expenditures to each site, I'll be evaluating which calculations capture those site costs most accurately, whether that's square footage, number of classrooms, number of staff, etc.
This leads me to comment a little bit to those people who are viewing, because it's important, as you can see and hear here, you need to document kind of how you're doing this, because you're going to want to have the same procedure, the same kind of allocation, decision-making year by year to make sure there's a continuation of, the reporting that could be comparable. But also just remembering a superintendent might leave, a school business official might leave, a bookkeeper might leave, and it'd be really important to have some pretty good documentation. And while you're not going to be doing this reporting until July of 19, as you make decisions today about how you're going to prepare for that, it's much easier to document now than it is to do that after the fact. But there is another item that's part of this reporting, and that's the exclusions, the things that are not part of site-based reporting. So, Susan, how are you approaching the exclusion category?
So a lot of effort has gone into the guidance document. So again, I will push you back to that information. I think ISBE's done a fantastic job with pulling that information together. But I suggest that the first thing you do is look at that exclusion appendix that says what items aren't going to be included as part of your reporting. They've done a great job using the Illinois Program Accounting Manual to identify what function codes or what objects we don't need to include in this reporting, and you should refer to that as your first step. I think a great example, and you mentioned this, Carrie, it's the adult and continuing education program will be excluded as part of this, and that's usually and typically accounted for in function 1300. I've worked in multiple school districts, and I can tell you that isn't always the case, and we all kind of sometimes use the accounting manual the way that it seems fit for us at that time. So I think you need to identify those expenditures that need to be excluded and determine where you're actually recording those items. So what do you do now? Again, it's really important that we assess this right now with the opportunity to fix it on the front end. So review that list of exclusions. Determine what exclusions apply to you. Identify where you're coding them, where your account system is actually tracking those items, and then determine before July 1st, before you're in your budget cycle, do you need to make some changes? Do you need to create some new accounts? Do you need to replace where you're accounting for them currently? And again, the key here is get it right on the front end, because it will simplify. This is going to be somewhat of a complex process, but if you can think about it ahead of time, it will make that year-end FY19 reporting that much simpler.
Acknowledging that everything we've asked and encouraged districts to do now can be quite a lot on everyone's plate, I don't want to wrap up our conversation without also noting that those districts that do have the capacity to do so could consider doing some early exploration of their site-based expenditures. Doing even an approximation of what you're spending by site right now can start those early conversations about fiscal equity, transparency, and connection to student outcomes, and will allow you to make some intentional changes now if you think it appropriate that will set you up for the year ahead to not only better serve students, but also be ready for thinking about how you talk about this reporting. And that can be anything from what you're tagging to where you're allocating resources to what conversations you're already starting in your district. And you've heard this multiple times already today, but I'm going to say it again. We really encourage everyone to thoroughly read that reporting guidance that's out there and then send any questions our way. We know that early and thoughtful preparation is going to be key to making this process a smooth one for your district and also make it as meaningful as possible for your students.
Just in comment on preparing and beginning the communication process and so forth, if I were a superintendent today, I would want to know what my narrative is going to be about the results that are coming forward in this reporting. I'd want to know it even now in some regard, because I'd want to prepare my board and also prepare a community for what they're going to see. When these things hit in October of 2019, developing the narrative at that moment is probably a little bit late. So that's just a recommendation I think that all districts should consider at this particular point in time. So on that note, Sarah, what can districts now expect next in regard to this effort?
Yeah, I think that district implementation timeline that we referred to earlier tries to capture that sense of where are we going to be in FY19 and what can we do to prepare ahead of that. So we've given that resource to districts to be thinking about their own actions, and we're also trying to reflect what resources that might need, that districts may need from ISBE in order to support them along the way. And so we have 3 different working groups that are continuing our work ahead to try to pave the way for you all. The first one is our training working group that is really focused on what are those resources and supports that we can provide to districts. This video came out of that brainstorming. The suggested district implementation timeline came out of that brainstorming, and those resources will be continuing to come out. You'll find out about them through the Superintendent's Weekly, by visiting our webpage, and through some of our professional organizations. We also have a data collection group. We've had a number of questions from districts saying, well, what's it going to look like in terms of how do we actually submit our data? And to that, I would say, first of all, the data table that is in our reporting guidance is actually what we will be asking of you. So even if you don't have the tool right now, you can still know what's the what is it that we'll be asking. But this data collection group is also working on what is the actual functional tool that we'll use to be able to solicit the data from you to then store it ISBE for reporting on the report card. And to that reporting on the report card, we also have a final group that's getting ready for our kickoff. This is our data visualization working group, being really thoughtful about how are these data points going to be presented on the report card in order to facilitate those kind of conversations that you spoke to earlier.
Great. And I want to thank everybody for bringing their experience and their expertise to this. Susan and Mike, for the hard work you did, in terms of beginning the process of doing this now and being able to give some guidance to that. I think our viewers have really gotten a good opportunity to see what the reality of this is going to be, what it's going to look like at the district level, and how you can do it well. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for Sarah and Carrie as well. Now, Sarah, one last time, what is that place where people can access more information and have their questions answered?
www.isbe.net/ESSA is our homepage. There is a header labeled Site-Based Expenditure Reporting that has all of our resources in chronological order. And after reviewing all of those materials or taking a look in depth at any one of them, any further clarifications or questions can come straight to me. My email address is sshaw, SSHAW, @isbe.net.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you again to our panelists. I think Illinois ISBE, those who are viewing on this, know that we're going to continue to be engaged with ISBE as this continues to move forward. And we want to make sure that everybody understands what this is and what it isn't, and actually how to make this be successful in your district. So as we wrap up here, thank you for viewing, and we'll be back and see you again soon.